This is Research Like a Pro, Episode 2, Research Objectives. Welcome to Research Like a Pro, a genealogy podcast about taking your research to the next level, hosted by Nicole Dyer and Diana Elder, accredited genealogy professional. Diana and Nicole are the mother-daughter team at FamilyLocket.com and the creators of the Amazon best-selling book, Research Like a Pro, A Genealogist's Guide. I'm Nicole, co-host of the podcast. Join Diana and me as we discuss how to stay organized, make progress in our research, and solve difficult cases. Let's go. All right, it's time for Episode 2, Research Objectives. So, can you tell us about what an objective is and why we would need to have one?
Sure. First of all, hello everyone, and thank you for listening. We're so excited to be talking about the Research Like a Pro method. And really, an objective is just a research question. So when you're doing your research, there's so many questions that are going through your head, and sometimes you just, do the shotgun approach where you just look up record after record after record, trying to answer a bunch of questions. And an objective is just something that lets you focus in on just one question, one thing that you want to learn. And so it's really great because a research objective keeps you from that surfing the internet, going from website to website, wasting time not knowing where you've been, what you've been looking at. And it really helps you to discipline yourself and make the best use of your time, because let's face it, we don't all have unlimited time to do our genealogy. We may wish we did, but we don't. We've got to be a little bit more focused so we can make some really, really good progress.
Yes, I think sometimes I go with the mindset of, I just want to learn everything about this person. But when I do that, I notice that I don't look for the most valuable record that would answer my question, which usually is, who are this person's parents? But I often find a lot about like their residence and where they lived and that kind of thing. So you're right. I think having an objective will help you find more answers rather than just doing a shotgun approach. I like how you said that. But just trying to find everything about a person.
Which is really how I researched for years. I was just trying to put together a pedigree and trying to fill out the family tree and just trying to find every single record that I could. I'd find out a new website and I'd immediately put all my ancestors' names that I could think of into that website, trying to find all these little pieces of information. And sometimes I would record them, sometimes I wouldn't. It was just so haphazard. And so I learned, gradually how to be better, but it really wasn't until I did the accreditation process that I learned to do an objective, because that is really key in the accreditation process. It's part of the testing. It's part of the 4-generation project. And I had to really learn the whole concept of an objective. So there's 3 kinds of objectives when it really comes down to it. You can identify an individual, you can prove a relationship, or you can just discover ancestor actions. So I think that a lot of times we want to jump into proving a relationship. We want to get back the next generation. Everybody's brick wall is always finding the parents of an ancestor. Those are the brick walls, right? But sometimes we need to step back and we need to really identify the ancestor we do know before we can try to find parents, because it's going to be in the clues that come from that ancestor's life that help us to identify parents. So that's one of the common mistakes that I find with people that I work with, that they want to jump right into finding parents when really they need to identify first of all. And Nicole, I think you had
to really identify them. Do you mean like telling the difference between them and somebody else, or how do you do that?
Absolutely. So I think we've all run into a circumstance where our ancestor has a man of the same name or a woman of the same name in the neighboring county, or sometimes in the same county, maybe in the neighboring state. And so you're looking at a census record, and how do you know if it's your John Smith or it's another John Smith? We've got to really, really be careful in trying to decide, which one is ours. And so identifying a person, each person is unique, and some of the unique identifiers would be birth, place, and date, marriage place, and date, their spouse. Death, place, and date. It could be their residence. It could be their occupation. It might be their occupation is the only thing that differentiates them from another person of the same name. So we have to look at all the different things that makes a person uniquely them. And so our research objective might be to find all of those, to clearly identify the person that we are researching. Does that make sense, Nicole?
Yeah, that makes really good sense. I know that we talked about earlier wanting to find everything about an ancestor, but I think this objective doesn't necessarily require that you find everything, but like you said, finding those unique identifiers that make them separate from other people in the same location with the similar name, or that help you understand who they were based on their associates and their relatives. If you know a person's spouse, then you really know a lot more about them than you did before.
Right. And so once you've identified your ancestor and you feel like you clearly know who is who, that this is your ancestor, then you can tackle that relationship brick wall, to say, or so to say, discovering the father, or discovering, maybe you're trying to discover a spouse. We don't always know who our spouses are of our ancestors. Maybe you're trying to discover all the children of an ancestor. So there's different kinds of relationships that you might be wanting to do for your objective. And relationships are a very, very common type of questions and objectives that we have. But another one is just to discover ancestor actions. You might want to discover the Civil War actions of an ancestor. And Nicole, I think you did a project on something similar to that, right?
Yes. So my first objective that I ever created was for my Eisenhower brothers Civil War project. And I wanted to discover if they served in the Civil War and what their actions were like during the war and right before. So I wrote this objective, and it said, discover the actions of the Eisenhower brothers, and then I listed their names, all three of them, during the Civil War. And like I said before in the last episode, that objective was too large. It ended up being a little bit too unmanageable. I didn't enjoy doing it all as one project. I would split it up next time. So do you think that's a good idea, to just have one person for an objective and not say, I want to follow three people's actions, but just to choose one? Or I want to identify all the children, or I want to just identify one child? What do you think?
You really have to look at how much time you have. I know some people in the study group wanted to identify all the children, but I think the particular person I'm thinking of found out there were 14 children, and that was a really huge objective. And so she really had to back down on that one and maybe just did a couple of them. So I think it's always good to start a little smaller than larger, because it will help us to stay focused and not get overwhelmed with an enormous project. So for instance, I'm working on identifying the father of my Cynthia Dillard, who is one of my brick walls. And there are a lot of Dillard men in Georgia that could be her father, but I've kind of narrowed it down to this one specific man, George W. Dillard. So I wrote my objective to determine if he was her father, rather than to just determine her father, because that would entail going through all the, 5 to 10 other Dillard men that it could be. So I decided to narrow my objective with that one. So I think each project is going to be unique. It's just important to look at them and decide what do I feel like doing right at this moment? How much time do I have? How much do I want to invest in this objective?
So take your first objective and then make it even more narrow.
Probably.
That's what I've noticed with all the study groups so far, is that the first objective that a lot of people write, they end up making it a little bit smaller just to encompass, a very specific goal.
I think that really helps us to feel more success, because we can actually, accomplish something that's a little bit smaller. So I think that's a really good idea to start with a little bit more narrow objective.
Yes, when I revisited my Eisenhower project for the work samples in the book, I ended up changing my objective to just focus on one brother. So my objective then said, identify the actions of Moses Eisenhower prior to and during the Civil War. And then I talked about the unique identifiers and things. But that was my main research question when I narrowed it down. And it made the project so much better because I really went and redid all the assignments just using that one objective. And it was amazing how much more I discovered because I wasn't bogged down by all of the facts about all the brothers. I could really spend mental energy just on that one question. So I think it was really helpful to recognize that being focused on a narrow objective really creates better results.
I agree with that. And, I'm thinking about the third type of objective, which is to discover ancestor actions. And I think that, it's really important that you make that pretty narrow. For instance, you might just want to be trying to discover if your ancestor was naturalized, because that's going to be a project all in and of itself, trying to research and figure out if they actually went through the process to become a United States citizen. And so you wouldn't want to say discover all the ancestors' actions. You'd want to narrow it down. Or maybe you're going to find out if your ancestor, for instance, you did the Civil War, but another action might just be, was he a landowner? And you might want to discover all of the land transactions. So there's a lot of different things that we can think about for an objective. And when you once you get your mind wrapped around this idea of narrowing it down and really focusing on a question, it kind of opens up so many possibilities for your research. So let's talk about how to actually come up with an objective. And I think that the most important thing to do is to really look at your pedigree. Start to analyze it and think about what you want to know. And you may not want to start off with a brick wall. If this is the first time you're going through the process, you may not want to start off with the very hardest question. Maybe you're just going to want to look at your pedigree and you notice that maybe an ancestor has 3 wives and you're not really sure if those are all accurate relationships. Maybe you just want to analyze his relationships and see who his spouses really were. And so you're going to look at your pedigree and try to look for some holes, some questions. Maybe there's no death date for someone and you want to try to find a death date, or maybe there's not a specific birthplace and you want to discover that. So really looking either if you've got an online tree on Ancestry or looking at the Family Search family tree or just your own specific database on your own computer, look through that and do a little analysis and find a question that's not too narrow or that's not too broad, that's narrow enough and doable enough for you to work through the process. And then after you've done it a few times, then you can maybe tackle some of those really difficult brick walls.
So with that one example that you just gave about looking and seeing that your ancestor was married 3 times, maybe an objective could be prove or disprove the relationship of great-great-great-grandfather to his second wife, who I don't know anything about. And that could be one objective?
Exactly. You wouldn't have to do all 3. You could just do one of them. And so that's a great idea and a good example of how you could narrow that down. So, yeah, perfect.
So great. So the first step is to analyze your pedigree and choose a question. So now what is step 2?
Okay, once you've done that, then you've got to actually formulate your research objective. It's not enough to just have it kind of be in your head, because what will happen is if you don't have it written down and in front of you, you'll get going on your research and then you'll think, oh, this is so interesting. Now I want to go discover something else with the ancestor. And you really will get going. That's how we get off, going down the rabbit hole, going after bright, shiny objects because we do not have something written down. So you've got to actually formulate that research objective. You've got to say something like, my research objective is to discover proof of my great-grandfather's second wife. And then you give your key identifiers and you write that down. I put it at the very beginning of my research. I call it the research plan document. And it's at the beginning of my research reports. When I turn in a client report, the objective is the very first thing that the client sees because they also need to be reminded of what they asked me to look for. So my objective is always at the top of my paper. It's at the top of my project. When I did my accreditation testing, I wrote out my objective and put it right in front of me, so I made sure I stayed on task.
So basically, the 3 steps to create an objective that you just talked about are to analyze your pedigree and choose a question, then formulate a research objective, and then write it down. So let's talk more about step 2, because you mentioned key identifiers or unique identifiers. So what are those?
The 3 key identifiers that I really always try to use are birth, marriage, and death. Those are the vital facts that we want to try to find about people. But we can't get too hung up on having exact dates because we may not know those. So I always just tell, study group members, anyone I'm working with, that it's okay to estimate. We usually have estimates of our ancestors based on the census records or, just our best guess. So we have birth, marriage, and death, and we have an estimated date, and we have a place if we can put them in a place. Now, another good key identifier is a spouse, and sometimes we have to go to something that's a little bit more vague, such as a residence. And so that can be an identifier also, and it may even be an occupation. You might have in England, we've got so many people with the same surnames. You might have 2 individuals in a village of the exact same surname, and they are only identified because of their occupation. And that could also be the case, say, in Denmark. I've seen some cases like that. So whatever is going to kind of uniquely identify that individual, that's what goes into your objective. You don't need to have a big, long objective telling about everything. You just need 2 or 3 simple sentences. So let me just give you an example. I'll just read you my objective from the book about my project for Cynthia Dillard. So as I said before, Cynthia Dillard is one of my brick walls. She was the spouse of my great-great-grandfather, Thomas Beverly Royston. They were in Alabama in the 1800s. And I've been trying to find her father for, 15 years, ever since we started researching. So this is the actual objective I came up with. And just kind of listen, Nicole, and see if you can hear my key identifiers.
Okay.
The objective of this research project is to determine if George W. Dillard, born 1781 in Virginia and died 1854 in Lee County, Alabama, is the father of Cynthia Dillard. Cynthia was born about 1816 in Georgia. She married Thomas Beverly Royston about 1833 in Georgia or Alabama and died 1882 in Collin County, Texas. So what did you notice there that were key identifiers?
Well, you actually had kind of 2 people since you're proving a relationship, so you had to give unique identifiers for both of them. So that was interesting. And then you had a date that George W. Dillard was born, so 1781 in Virginia. So that wasn't very specific as far as an exact birth date or an exact place within Virginia, but it's the best you have, right?
That's right.
But then when he died, you do have a specific county, so that's a much better identifier that you had a Lee County, Alabama, in 1854 as his death place. So, and then you also had his middle initial, which is helpful, George W. Dillard. So sometimes just having a more complete name can help you have a more complete identifier. And then, of course, you talked about Cynthia, and you have her birth year and state, and then her husband too. So that was a really good identifier there with her spouse's name.
Right. So you'll notice that I didn't put in a bunch of other details. I didn't have to say that she was in the 1850 census in this county, or that they had land in a certain county, or that she had 14 children. I didn't need to put all of that into the objective, because the objective is supposed to be just simply saying what you're going to do and identifying your people. All of that other information is going to come later in the project. That's going to be that'll be in your timeline, your background information. So you don't have to put everything that you know about your person into the objective. And that's one of the things that I see that people new to this process sometimes want to do, is just put a whole bunch of information into their objective. And that's not what we're going to do. We're just going to keep it simple but very, very complete. So full names, and this is not supposed to be fabulous writing. This is a very this is a tool for us, and so it's okay to have it not flow super well. It's not exactly a novel that we're writing here with this objective.
So when we're writing the objective, we shouldn't put everything we know into it. Just focus on those vital key identifiers, those vital facts, if we have them: birth, marriage, and death. But if we don't have anything like that, or maybe say we just have a birth year, but we don't have a place, you mentioned maybe we could use a residence place instead if we don't have a place of birth or a place of marriage or a place of death.
That's right. In fact, I have a really interesting project that I'm doing right now. And I talked a little bit about this in episode 1, and it was to identify Georgia A. Dawson. And all I have is her will. But I'm interested in her because in her will, she names her nieces, Sarah and Mary Royston, and she is one county over from my Cynthia Dillard Royston, who I'm trying to figure out who Cynthia's father is. And so I'm so curious to see if this Georgia could possibly be a sister to my Cynthia. And so I've had this abstract of a will probably for 5 years and have kept wondering about this. And so I finally made it my research question and objective for this current study group. And so my objective really didn't have a lot of key identifiers because I didn't know anything about this woman, Georgia A. Dawson. I just had her will. So my objective basically was to identify Georgia A. Dawson, who left a will. I did have the date and the place of the will. And that's all I was able to use for my objective because that's all I had on her. So I was taking one document, a probate, her will, and formed my objective around that document. So that was a little bit more unusual for a research objective, but it worked because there's only one woman who wrote that will. So she was a unique individual.
Right. Well, great. So now that we have discussed key identifiers and how important that is when we formulate our objective, the last step is to write it down. So you mentioned that we have a research project document that we use to write it down in. We actually have this as a template for those who purchase the book, Research Like a Pro, a Genealogist Guide. And the template is in the book and also in the online area for the book. So go check out the book if you want to use the template there for the project document. And if you don't have that, just write it down at the beginning of your Word document or in your notebook or wherever it is, but it's important to write it down, right?
It is really important to write it down. And I really would suggest that you type it out and put it right in front of you on your computer screen, on a sticky note, or wherever you can see it. Because if you haven't been using this type of a focused process, you will just want to start going back to old habits and bad habits of just jumping around website to website. So that research objective can just keep you focused. And when you find a new website or a new source, you're not going to try to look up everybody in that. You're going to remember that you're only researching a specific individual right here. And so get it written down, get it on paper. And if you're part of the Research Like a Pro community, we have a secret Facebook group for all those who purchase the book, and you can write out your objective there for those of us in the group, and we can give you some feedback on that so that you can make sure you really feel like you're on the right track for the Research Like a Pro process.
So I was just thinking about the time when I was doing my Eisenhower Brothers project and researching Moses Eisenhower. There was a point in my research where I found a record that I didn't know if it pertained to Moses or another man of the same name. And that's when I had to go back to my objective and really remember, who is my Moses again? Because this other Moses looks a lot like him, but it's a different man because they were two different military records. And one Moses died, and then a year later, another man with the same name joined in a nearby regiment. So I had this crisis during my research where I had to really go back to my objective and remind myself the key identifiers for my Moses. What year did I say he was born in based on my, my previous research? And I had to actually take a break from researching actions and further identify Moses and kind of make sure that I had everything I needed to know to match additional records to him. So I was glad that I had written out an objective and put in his wife's name and so on, because finding out the other Moses's wife and children, then I could quickly say, well, this doesn't pertain to my Moses because my Moses was married to somebody else.
That's a really great example. And you touched on something there that sometimes we'll get going on a research project and we'll realize we need to tweak our objective because we'll realize, oh my goodness, this is way too broad. I've got to narrow this down. Or I've had people in the study group that they realized their objective wasn't broad enough, that it was too easy and they wanted to have something more difficult. So just know that you're going to set a research objective and that if you need to change it a little bit, that's perfectly okay. This is just a tool to help us stay focused, to get us going in the right direction. And there's nothing that says it's set in stone, that we can certainly go back and do a little changing here and there if we feel like we need to once we get going in a project.
So for beginners just starting out in their research, what kind of objective would you, recommend? Would you have them start with themselves and go back to their parents and grandparents, great-grandparents, or is it okay to start with your great-great-great-grandfather if you haven't done any research on that line before? What do you think?
I think it's really important to start with the people we know. So if you've never researched at all, then start with maybe a grandparent and get a little bit of experience in researching them. Like maybe you had a grandfather that served in World War II or World War I, and maybe it would be fun to research their war service and do something that is going to be not too overwhelming, something kind of specific. And I always recommend, if you are extending your pedigree, that you start with the links that you know. So you go to your parents, then you do the links to their parents, then the links to the next generation. You go step by step, methodically, making sure each link is solid, because you don't want to end up climbing the wrong branch of the family tree because there was something incorrect. And really, really important to not believe everything that's online because there's so much misinformation on the online trees. So make sure you're doing your own good, solid research, finding those really good, solid links, those sources.
Right. You don't want to build on something that hasn't been verified. That would be awful.
Well, and that's exactly right. And we had that happen in our tree. I don't know if you remember.
Yes. And in fact, it was just a couple years ago that we discovered that discovery I made back when I was 16 was wrong.
We've had a few of those situations where we've had the wrong ancestors and we've had to do some corrections. So it is important to make sure you've got the right people.
We reviewed that research and realized, hey, this doesn't match up. Let's see if this could match better. And then sure enough, revisiting it all, realizing that Elizabeth Welch also went by Melissa Welch, and correlating that evidence, it all just came together.
Right. It's really fun. And everyone will have those little quirks in their research. In fact, I had cousins that had the same name in the same county and their birthdays were very similar. And I had the wrong man as my great grandfather, and he was actually the cousin. So, we can have really crazy things when you have families that all live together and they all name their children the same. You've got to be really careful with those kind of situations. So that's why we love it, because it's always a big mystery. It's a big puzzle, and it's fun unraveling the pieces, putting it all together.
It is. It's exciting. And I had never written a research objective before I started the study group. So it was an interesting exercise. So hopefully all the listeners can go try and write an objective.
Right. It sounds simple, but it actually is a little bit more difficult than you might think. So don't take it for granted that it's just something that you will remember. Make sure you get it written down, put it someplace where you'll remember. First step in your research project to get an objective done.
Great. Well, next time we'll talk more about the Research Like a Pro process, and we'll talk about analyzing your sources, which is super fun.
Oh, it is. I love looking back at all of my sources and seeing if there's some new things that I missed the first time through. So stay tuned, everyone, and we're going to have some fun.
All right. That's the end of today's episode. Bye-bye. Thank you for listening to Research Like a Pro with Diana Elder, accredited genealogy professional, and Nicole Dyer. We hope that something you heard today will help you make progress in your own genealogy research. If you like what you heard, please leave us a review on iTunes or Stitcher, or visit our website, familylocket.com, to contact us. You can find our book, Research Like a Pro, A Genealogist Guide, on Amazon.com and other booksellers. We hope you'll start now to research like a pro